Today, as we continue in our series considering secular worldviews and secular philosophies, today I want to consider the last of the isms, the last of the secular philosophies in this series before considering different areas of life where we will see these philosophies emerge and converge in government, economics, science, art, literature. So before we peruse those areas, I want to consider, again, the last of the isms we want to consider in this series, and that is hedonism. So today I've entitled our session, Pursuing Pleasure. Now at the outset, I want to briefly explain that as we consider hedonism and some of and Stoicism as well, I am going to wait until toward the conclusion of this particular session to consider the pleasure as is found in Christianity. So at the outset, it might seem like I'm an enemy of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. I think this is a natural tendency to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And so as we peruse this specific philosophy, again, I anticipate returning to the pleasure found in Christianity. So hedonism, this is the Greek of hedone, so you have eta, delta, omicron, nu, and eta again. So this is hedone, which means pleasure. There was actually a goddess named Hedone. And so what the hedonists were pursuing was basically seeking and optimizing pleasure and minimizing pain, which is, again, indicative of our human nature. We all seek pleasure and avoid pain. But again, they change this into a worldview, into a philosophy, into a way of life. In other words, the greatest good, the real truth, that which is true, is determined by pain and pleasure, the optimal pleasure and the minimum pain. So recognize that I'm not using, and deliberately so, I'm not saying that they pursue the maximum of pleasure. They pursue the optimum of pleasure. Okay, now before we get into this too much, when we think of Athens, we think of Greek philosophy, we think of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, maybe Alexander the Great. But long before Socrates came on the scene, there were Greek philosophers, two of which I want to just briefly mention, Parmenides and Heraclitus. And they had a stark difference of ontology. Ultimately, Parmenides said whatever is, and Heraclitus said that everything is in a state of flux. Everything is in a state of becoming. And so what happened after these two giants of philosophical thought couldn't be synthesized and there was no agreement, that gave way to a great period of skepticism. So what filled the void were people referred to as sophists. Okay, I'm sure we've heard in our day of sophistry when you are saying somebody is exercising sophistry, what you're saying is that they're actually plain thinking. They're not really thinking through anything. These were the relativists of the ancient world. So relativism isn't a new phenomenon. So when we considered that in our last session, we were considering the recent trend toward relativism. But these were the absolute skeptics. Now, the sophists actually were the ones who developed oratory, so rhetorical skills and so on. There was a man by the name of Demosthenes who would put pebbles in his mouth in order to be able to enunciate better, just to practice with these stones in his mouth to again, just make his mouth stronger and able to proclaim things better. But the sophists, in their oratory, ultimately, it didn't necessarily matter if what they were saying was true. The ultimate test was found in, does it work? We can see this in our modern advertising campaigns. it doesn't necessarily have to be true that this car is wonderful and drives smoothly and is absolutely dependable and will get you from A to B. It doesn't matter how true that is. The question, the test is, does it produce sales? How effective is it? So, between the time of Parmenides and Heraclitus, there was a great period of skepticism, okay, and relativism, where in addition to this, you had a group called the Cyrenaics, okay? And this started developing right around the 4th century. Now, this is what's referred to as crude or crass or vulgar hedonism. This is the hedonism that I'm sure some of us are familiar with. We've seen in movies, older movies typically. I don't know if the newer generation has these in our movies, but I remember old films depicting this drunken, orgiastic situation. Ultimately, this is where you seek the maximum sensuous enjoyment, pleasure. Okay, you're seeking the maximum senses. Ultimately, since we can't find truth, because they recognize that we can only know so much with our senses, right? We can only get so far with empiricism, and we can only get so far with rationalism. And so they decided to, in order to seek for the absolute perfect peace of mind, we'll get to that here in a second, but in order to pursue this, we must leave off the pursuit of truth and look for the pursuit of pleasure. So ultimately, the peace of mind, the truth, reality, life is found in maximizing or optimizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Now, this is the gross form of hedonism, okay? So again, these are the Cyrenaics, basically in the 4th century BC, which again is a crass form of hedonism. Now, what they would do in this time, there's the Roman god Bacchus, and the Greek counterpart is Dionysus. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Bacchanalia, but these people would have these rituals, these religious festivals. So hedonism is also a religion, but they would have these religious festivals, really getting absolutely drunk as they possibly could, be filled with orgies. And so these temple prostitutes were really given over for the connection to these gods. Okay, so these were the means through which the person can connect to ultimate reality through their senses and so on. This sensuous experience. They must remove and leave off again their consciences and so on, and just seek to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Okay, so Bacchus, it was the god of the vine, so the god of grapes, the god of wine, ultimately. And so what they were looking for is euphoria, okay? Because again, there is no absolute real pursuit of truth, and so what they desired to do was to seek for euphoria through this drunken stupor, through the minimizing of their minds, really, and elevating their senses, okay? And so this is where this is somewhat moved into our day with the drug culture of this nation. Really, it is a form of escapism. And really, that's what these hedonists were looking for. That's what they were pursuing, is some form of escape. Okay, so, but again, the Cyrenaics were the crass form of hedonism. Later, you had what is referred to as the Epicureans. Okay, these are more refined hedonists. Okay, we'll get to that here in a second. But in chapter 17 of the book of Acts, we see Paul going to Athens, and his spirit is grieved, is moved within him, because he sees the city is given over to idolatry, and it grieves his heart. So he starts to go out into the synagogues, into the marketplace. I mean, this is Paul being Paul. But then he's met in chapter 17, verses 16 through 18. It says, "Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Therefore, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some say, what does this babbler want to say? That is how Paul is greeted from these Epicureans and Stoics. Now, the Epicureans and Stoics were at absolute enmity. They were hostile toward one another. They did not like. They were competing for a greater place in being accepted by the populace and in the marketplace and so on. So, interestingly, the only two philosophies mentioned in all of Scripture are Epicureanism and Stoicism. Now, Stoicism has had a recent rise in our day. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've seen I've come across many people who are embracing Stoicism. Now, what is interesting about Epicureanism and Stoicism is that they actually have quite a bit in common. That's not so obvious at the outset. So what the Epicureans and the Stoics were looking for is what's referred to as philosophical ataraxia. Okay, I'm sure, again, this is a fancy little term that philosophers like to use to make it very difficult for anybody to know about philosophy. Ataraxia, and Atarax actually was a brand name of a drug that was basically a tranquilizer. It's still, the drug itself, the generic form anyway, is still in the marketplace, but the brand fizzled out for economic reasons ultimately. But it's ultimately is something of a tranquilizer for anxiety, itching, and so on. So doctors would probably be familiar with Atarax, but again. So philosophical ataraxia is basically a peace of mind. Philosophical peace of mind. Again, I don't know why we can't just say peace of mind instead of making, being fancy and pretending that we're, far more knowledgeable than we actually are. So again, they're pursuing philosophical peace of mind. Now, they went about it in two different ways, but this is what they're pursuing, because again, the pursuit of truth is a lost one. We give that pursuit up entirely, and so we must pursue a peace of mind. Since we can't gain peace of mind through truth, because truth is unattainable, we must find it through some other means, basically through feelings. Okay, and so these are the philosophies that emphasize feelings more than mind. Okay, now again, I'm not an enemy of feelings. Okay, and we'll get to that as we continue. But again, these two philosophies were looking for philosophical ataraxia. Now, the Epicureans, again, these are the refined hedonists. So far from the Cyrenaics, the Cyrenaics were looking for optimal sensuous pleasure and minimizing pain and so on. These would seek for, or would look for a certain amount of pleasure because they encountered what is referred to as the hedonistic paradox. And what this paradox basically is if you pursue pleasure and don't attain it, what happens? You get frustrated. Especially the more you pursue it and you fail, you get frustrated. Let's say you pursue it and you attain it. And you attain it again and again and again. What happens? You get bored, which is another form of pain. So frustration is one form of pain. Its counterpart, boredom, is another form of pain. So if you win as a hedonist, you lose. If you lose as a hedonist, you lose. It's a no-win situation. So what they decided to do is basically regulate how much pleasure we're actually seeking. So the Epicureans in our day would basically be the gourmet professionals, the ones who know all about the culinary arts, know all about the fine sauces, the sommeliers, what are they called, right? The wine experts, sommeliers, yes. See, I can be fancy too. These are the wine experts, but they're not drunkards. They just are experts in wine. You have these with fashion and so on. So, whereas the Cyrenaics would just engage in gross orgies and many sexual activities and so on, the Epicureans would basically seek for a certain amount of adultery. Just a little bit of adultery. just enough to get your senses going and to satisfy your senses. So just a little bit of adultery, just a little bit of vice here and there sprinkled about. And so that's what basically the Epicurean system is. And that's what's basically in our modern day. I mean, nobody's going to be, or at least admit that they're crass Cyrenaics, that they're crass hedonists. This is a more refined hedonism. And this is the one we find in our day. Okay. Now the Stoics, basically, their song ultimately was que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. This is essentially, and they won't like this, and I don't care. But what they are is an absolute fatalistic, deterministic philosophy. Ultimately, we cannot control what happens to us. And so what we can control is how we react to things. So if I catch a disease, a life-threatening disease, that's just the fates being fates. Okay, but what I can control is how I respond to it. So what they were looking for is what's referred to as imperturbability. All right, we're getting fun and fancy. Now, I'm sure you're not familiar with imperturbability, but I'm sure you're fairly familiar with being perturbed. Okay, so basically they're avoiding, at whatever cost, any frame of any sort of emotive response. In other words, don't ever get too high, don't ever get too low. If something great happens, then you're of the same character, you're of the same disposition as if something terrible, as if when something terrible happens. So it's a form of equilibrium. It's an emotional equilibrium, just equal on either side, it doesn't really matter. So again, the Stoics and the Epicureans were looking for peace of mind outside of truth in these two vacuous and vain ways. Now, so I want to consider for a moment somewhat of a controversial figure, okay? A man by the name of Oscar Wilde from the 19th century. He was an Irish poet who lived in England for a while, but he was known for his hedonistic lifestyle. He had homosexual relations. He had a problem with pedophilia. You know, it's kind of interesting. So he was kind of the first one on the scene to pursue a change in legislation to allow for his moral assumptions to be manifest and to be exercised. Ultimately, his opinion was the laws shouldn't keep me from living out my sensuous desires, ultimately. Now, in our day, we excuse things such as homosexuality as being something with which someone is born. But somehow, pedophilia doesn't get... However, we did see a recent rise of this with the MAP situation, minor attracted persons or people or whatever. I mean, what a gross situation. Homosexuality is a perversion. Not because I'm saying so. It is against nature. That is what Paul says. I mean, what could be more clear? This doesn't make me hateful. I love the homosexuals. I mean, they are people and we are called to love them. We get the privilege of loving them. But the act of homosexuality is obviously unnatural at the very least, and certainly ungodly. Now, Oscar Wilde is something of a complicated figure. He had a lifetime really of he sought for Christ somewhat, but Christ was rather inconvenient in many of his ways. But he did truly seek, and he had a certain affection for Christ, and he was a fond fan. He was a fan of Blaise Pascal. I love Blaise Pascal. I mean, for anyone who hasn't read his Pensées, should. They're just basically thoughts, you know. So, but he's wonderful, and he had said, if God gives us the pleasure of loving one woman, we want to love two. If he had given us the privilege of loving 10, we would have wanted 11. Our hunger is to be a law unto ourselves. And he was originally an empiricist. a huge mathematician. And he recognized, though, mathematics kind of breaks down when you're talking about a relationship. In mathematics, 1 and 1 is 2. But in a relationship, 1 and 1 are 1. In a marriage relationship, 1 and 1 plus 1 is still 1. Okay? Now, the thing about Oscar Wilde, again, in his sensuous appetite, what he also loved was the story of Michelangelo. Michelangelo, the artist, typically liked to draw people in the nude. And his teacher asked him at one point, Michelangelo, what is with this? What are you doing? And what Michelangelo replied, he said, I want to see people how God sees people. And his teacher made the salient point, but Michelangelo, you're not God. You are not God. Oscar Wilde loved that story, but he never embraced it. It never came into his soul. However, he did have what's referred to as a deathbed conversion. Ultimately, the last second, he was given last rites, the prayer and the blessing, the Catholic blessing, ultimately just before you die. And deathbed conversions are something of a controversial topic anyway within theology. And this is where I get to rest in the great peace and satisfaction and trusting that I am not judged. There's one who is so great and ever faithful, and I trust in his judgments and so on. But he wrote several works, okay? One of which is the Ballad of Reading Jael. Okay, let's just start to go to it. It's G-A-O-L, but it's pronounced Jael. It's close to jail. Okay, it kind of rhymes with tail, but it's even closer to Jael, who is actually in the book of Judges. She's Deborah's contemporary. If you haven't read that story, it's a wonderful story. Both Deborah and Jael are heroines of that story because there are no heroes of that story. But so this is the Ballad of Reading Jael. He was actually imprisoned for a time for reasons for which you can look yourself. But I want to read portions of this and then again really give the Christian counter perspective. But this is something that reveals the pursuit after Christ and receiving Christ before his deathbed conversion. So the Ballad of Reading Jael reads thus. I never saw sad men who looked with such a wistful eye upon that little tint of blue we prisoners called the sky, and at every careless cloud that passed in happy freedom by. For man's grim justice goes its way, it will not swerve aside. It slays the weak, it slays the strong, it has a deadly stride. With iron heel it slays the strong, the monstrous parricide. And as one sees most fearful things in the crystal of a dream, we saw the greasy hempen rope hooked to the blackened beam, and heard the prayer the hangman's snare strangled into a scream. And all the woe that moved him so, that he gave that bitter cry, and the wild regrets and the bloody sweats, none knew so well as I. For he who lives more lives than one, more deaths than one, must die. I know not whether laws be right, or whether laws be wrong. All that we know who lie in jail is that the wall is strong, and that each day is like a year whose days are long. But this I know, that every law that men have made for man, since first man took his brother's life, and the sad world began, but straws the wheat and saves the chaff with a most evil fan. And thus we rust life's iron chain, degraded and alone. And some men curse, and some men weep, and some men make no moan. But God's eternal laws are kind, and break the heart of stone. And every human heart that breaks, in prison cell or yard, is as that broken box that gave its treasure to the Lord, and filled the unclean leper's house with the scent of costliest nard. Ah, happy they whose hearts can break, and peace of pardon win. How else may man make straight his plan, and cleanse his soul from sin? How else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in? And he of the swollen purple throat, and the stark and staring eyes, waits for the holy hands that took the thief to paradise. And a broken and a contrite heart the Lord will not despise. The man in red who reads the law gives him 3 weeks of life, 3 little weeks in which to heal his soul of his soul's strife, and cleanse from every blot of blood the hand that held the knife. And with tears of blood he cleansed the hand that held the steel. For only blood can wipe out blood, and only tears can heal. And the crimson stain that was of Cain became Christ's snow-white seal. And there, till Christ call forth the dead, in silence let me lie. No need to waste the foolish tear, or heave the windy sigh, for I have killed the thing I loved, and so I have to die. Only the blood of Christ can cleanse a sinner such as I. As he died, as he was dying, he had portions of this read to him which convicted him, and that's why he called for a priest. He called for a priest and a Bible, because he had come to finally realize that though he couldn't live this faith, he must die in this faith. So whether his conversion was sincere or no, I love the heart that is at least pictured in this deathbed conversion. Now, as Christians, we are not enemies of pleasure, but sadly, the Bible makes abundantly clear that when we embrace certain values, and when we follow our wonderful, faithful God, we encounter pain, we encounter trial. God the Father sent his Son to a cross. Jesus wasn't a hedonist when he came to Jerusalem and wept, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets, how I would have gathered you as a hen her chicks, but you would not." He wasn't a hedonist as he entered Jerusalem, but it was the pleasure of his Father, and it is his pleasure in seeking the Father's will that he went up to Jerusalem and entered and climbed the hill of Golgotha. Now I want to consider a couple of passages in the Old Testament just to clarify that this isn't a merely Christian phenomenon. This has its roots in Judaism. This has a very long history. Okay, so the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah 53 verses 10 and the beginning of verse 11, reads, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him." That is Yahweh. That is God the Father. It pleased the Father to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days. And the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. Jesus, in seeing all of the sinners coming to him because of the cross, is pleased at the outpouring of his blood, at the giving of his life. He sees the labor of his soul and is satisfied. So this really kind of depicts the pleasure of God, the wonderful pleasure that God has in even sending his Son to suffer for us. That was his plan, and he is pleased for that plan to be accomplished. Now, our pleasure can be found in we can find this many places. Psalm 16, verses 9 through 11. "Therefore, my heart is glad, and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol. Nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." So the Christian's pursuit of pleasure and minimizing pain is defined entirely different. We do seek pleasure. I mean, I seek for my tummy to be filled every day. Okay, I seek again a certain amount of pleasure, and I try to reduce pain. When I get a headache, I take ibuprofen. Okay, I try to minimize pain, but we don't make it this summum bonum, the highest good of our lives. It is not it is not the standard through which we live our lives. It is a subcategory. And so seeking the pleasure of our God, sometimes we do encounter pain. We don't seek pain. We don't seek suffering. It's kind of interesting. There are masochists, sadly, within the Christian faith who inflict pain upon themselves because they think this is pleasing God somehow, which is interesting. They seek to inflict pain upon themselves, however, not to avoid pain, not to avoid pleasure, but to attain pleasure. I mean, it's a kind of strange backward thinking of pleasure and pain, but inflicting pain upon themselves, they are gaining the pleasure they are seeking for inflicting the pain. The Christian is no masochist. The Christian seeks the pleasure of the will of God, seeks his goodness at whatever peril. The martyrs of old, the Christian martyrs are never, the true ones, never seek persecution, never seek martyrdom. But when it comes, they embrace it to glorify our God. So the pleasure for the Christian is ultimately found in the presence of our God through the constant reading and meditation of his word and fellowship with him. Pleasure. What is true pleasure? Pleasure is only found in that which is good. And what is good? Someone once said, there is only one who is good. Why do you call me good? I love that he stopped that young man. The young man comes and says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus stops and says, why do you call me good? There's none good but God. And I just can imagine all the apostles kind of getting annoyed, like, Jesus, will you just answer his question? Why do you always have to be so complicated? But he was opening him up within his own assumptions. Ultimately, why do you call me God? Good. There's only one good. Are you calling me God? If you're calling me God, listen to what I say. But if you're just using this as a means of a welcome and so on, in other words, if this is insincere, then your pursuit of your actual pursuit of eternal life is also likewise insincere. I love that. Why do you call me good? Why do we call him good? Because he is good. We get glimpses of goodness because he made us in his image. But what's interesting about evil is that evil actually has no reality. It has no being. Evil only exists because of the good. The good has true being because its being is God. But you can have good without evil. That's just the way things ought to be. That's reality. You can have good without evil. You cannot have evil without good. It's an interesting problem for secularists and atheists and theodicy. So why is there evil when there's such thing as such a one as a perfect and good God? And that subject's more complicated, and I'm not about to approach it. But one right now anyway. But one interesting thing is when people lament all the evil in this world, it's pretty fun to show them that when they are lamenting evil, then there must be a good, and there must be an objective good, not one that that fits your little fancies and changes and ebbs and flows according to your likeness, but one which is fixed to his. He is pure goodness, and at his right hand are pleasures forevermore. We get a taste of heaven now. Heaven is a destination. Without God, there is no heaven. God is our glory. When we find our rest, Augustine made the salient point that God, oh God, thou hast made us for thyself, and restless are our hearts until they find the rest in thee. What a wise man our Saint Augustine was. But truly, that is absolutely right. The ones who refuse God and seek pleasure outside of the good are wandering, are aimless pilgrims, wandering absolutely aimlessly, and thus they are lost. When our hearts find our rest in the glory, in the sovereignty, and in the goodness of God, we are fixed to the rock of ages, then we build our house on the rock and not on sand. Seeking pleasure outside of God is building a house on sand. The maximum pain is in the pit of hell. The maximum or optimal place of pleasure is at his right hand. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore, where we find our rest in him, where we find the truth, the way, and the life, and through him find pleasures forevermore.